Hello there, my name is H.L.G. Wallace, but you can just call me H, and I am a fantasy writer and poet. So, this podcast is essentially just going to be an outlet for me to talk about my favourite genre, which is fantasy. So, the idea I've got for the moment is that each episode will just basically be me talking about a different fantasy property, game, story, music maybe even. And trying to talk about lesser known or a bit more obscure things by just generally gushing over my favourite genre of anything, which is fantasy. So it made the most sense for this first episode to be, as you've seen the title, of why I love fantasy, to kind of, introduce myself, if you will, and talk about my own kind of journey into becoming a fantasy fan, and even how that's influenced my own writing. So I think the probably most interesting way to do it is to talk about, my history of being a fan, and then explaining my own style and the kind of stuff I do at the end, if you're sticking around to listen to that. So I think it's kind of hard to think back as to why specifically it's fantasy that I love. Because I think I grew up on a lot of different things. I had a lot of the James Bond films, and I've definitely watched a lot of sci-fi, but nothing kind of grasps me as strongly as fantasy does. And kind of to me, at least in my kind of early years, the only things I can think of are, one, the 1970s, maybe 80s, Robin Hood film, animated film, where it's they're all animal people. He's a fox. Maid Miriam, she's a fox as well. And I think that's a very loose idea of fantasy, because that's also another thing I'll probably grapple with, is what is fantasy? But I don't know. I think kind of works in the same vein of, say, Reynard the Fox and things along those lines, where the fact that they're not just people kind of gives me the license to say that they are fantasy. But yeah, oh my god, such a good film. The best kids film, I think, ever, in my opinion. It's so fun, and the whistling tune at the beginning still is classic to me. But that it's got themes of, chivalry and kind of adventure, and obviously it's Robin Hood, so that's a classic British story. And it's so good. Anyway, so there's that. And then I remember we had a neighbour when I was growing up, and they had, on their computer, they had a Fisher-Price night game, which was it was a point and click adventure. I remember it was really quick, and I would go around, because they had kids the same age as me and my siblings, so we're all friends, but I would just go around talk to the dad, be like, can I play the game? And I'll just play it for a couple of hours and go home. But yeah, it was I can't remember. I remember, I think one night was going to get fired in a catapult or something, and you had to save them, and one was stuck in a swamp. But it was the visual kind of side of things, and also the chivalry, but just seeing all the characters in the armor and the swords and the shields and just all that kind of stuff. And I also had the classic Fisher-Price plastic castle, which was legendary. So I think that was kind of my early introduction, because to the best of my knowledge, I don't think I was really introduced to fantasy by anyone in my the family, because no one's really that nerdy. I think nowadays, say my sibling cousins and stuff, they've gone to Marvel and whatnot, but I think growing up, unless I'm grossly forgetting someone's huge influence in my life, but who knows. So I think kind of having that from a young age was very cool. And also, I think when I was so young, it wasn't like a genre. It was just a cool thing that I enjoyed. And then I was kind of in the lucky generation to grow up with the Harry Potter films, because I think like the main cast, like the main three, are like around my age. Maybe I think they're like a couple years older. But it was the kind of thing of like when the first film came out, I was a little kid, and as they kind of became teens, I was a teen, and by the end of it, when the themes were getting a bit more mature and it was getting like literally and kind of narratively a bit darker, I was kind of older for it then as well. So, and I think it's something where, whilst it's something that I don't lean on heavily, it would be quite hard for me to say that I have taken no influence from Harry Potter and just the sheer effect it had on the world. And yeah, so I think kind of that was like my foundation. And there's certain other things, say like Hellboy, which I came to when I was a bit like in my teens, which isn't necessarily like classic fantasy, but it's got stuff like kind of demons and like Arthurian legend and a lot of these things, and it's kind of wrapped up in a very like modern lens, but kind of finding that and seeing a new aspect of kind of the paranormal just blew my mind completely. And yeah, so I think kind of from there I've grown a lot, and I think I've definitely read quite a few like fantasy novels. I tend to sway more towards the like older ones. I listen to like some of the audiobooks of like The King of Elfland's Daughter and certain stuff like that. Although I'd say kind of in terms of books, my biggest influences are like folklore and mythology. I absolutely love it. Like, and I think just the weirdness and the kind of inherent darkness to a lot of like the folklore. I think mythology is very grand, or it can be. And I think that's kind of, I mean, there's a lot of mythologies from a lot of different places. But I think the generic kind of, say, Greek mythology that I'm thinking of, the scope of it feels like it's very much influenced like high fantasy. Whereas I feel like folklore, you can get like big things like one favourite like tidbit of folklore that I can always remember is I lived nearish a place called Devil's Dyke, and the story for it is basically, if you have no idea, it's just a massive ditch, and it's so like high and deep that people like paraglide off it and stuff. It's really cool, but the story is essentially that, or the folklore of it is that the devil was trying to dig like a moat to bring the sea in to like flood all the churches of England. But during the night as he was digging, he woke up like an old lady, and there's various kind of things where it was, one, she lit a lantern, and another one is that she had like a pet rooster or something, and it kind of called. And the idea is like the devil thought it was daytime, so he kind of got scared off, and that's just why you got the Devil's Dyke. But stuff like that feels very like classic fantasy, but then you can really like delve into other stuff and it just gets like super dark and weird, which I love. And yeah, but I think kind of nowadays I find a lot of inspiration from like games and shows and films. A big one for me is the FromSoft games. Like, I've completed Dark Souls 2 and Elden Ring, but I've watched Let's Plays of like all of them. And yeah, and just the kind of world that they build, and obviously they're like notoriously dark fantasy. But I find kind of there's a line between the FromSoft games and Hidetaka Miyazaki's, and Hayao Miyazaki from Ghibli. Like, they're kind of, I don't know, at least in my mind, they're like a yin and yang kind of thing, because Ghibli's also a big inspiration for me. But with Ghibli, like there's such vivid, beautiful worlds, and it feels so like effortless and natural on how like everything works, and they're just incredible. But I think obviously they're kids' films, so they're supposed to be like fun and uplifting, but I always find there's an element of like sadness or kind of melancholy or especially grief. And then on the other side, like with the FromSoft games, they're very much on the opposite end of the spectrum, where it's like a desolated kingdom, and you're having to find these great lords, and you have to do like all the hard work in this like place that's dying essentially. But somehow there's always elements of like beauty, and it's really interesting. And I think it's like Dark Souls 2 is honestly my like favorite game of all time, not because it's the best game, just because it's the one that got me into the series, and it's just so wonderfully weird. But kind of in that, there's like the singers, or which have like a connection to Nito, or like the story between like Zuli and Alva, and even just Majula. Like, I think looking back on kind of my big influences, or kind of my themes I always go back to, there's one I always have of like light, and having like sunlight, and like the golden rays of sunlight representing necessarily like hope or freedom or positive things. And I honestly think that comes from Majula, because I think like the FromSoft games have been dissected to like death, and it's great because half the stuff I watch is just about FromSoft. But someone made a good point where it's like all the other, and I think this was on the Bonfire Side Chat podcast, they made a point where it was like all the other hubs have kind of been I don't know, tainted in some way, whether it's like you find like a sad abandoned version of it, or you have to like fight someone in it. But like Majula always stays pure, and it's physically, or it's like visually bright. Like you're on like a seaside cliff, and you've got the sea, and it's always sunny and it's beautiful. And if you play the game right, then it just gets filled with more and more people, and it's just, I don't know. And that's a complete tangent. But like, it's kind of the point of why I need to make this podcast, because I just need to talk about all this stuff, and whether or not people listen will be a bonus. But yeah, that's kind of like where I'm now. And I've been watching Record of Lodoss War, which is, I mean, it's dated in some ways, but it's great. Like, it's pure like old school fantasy, which I absolutely love. And been enjoying some B kind of movie films like Hawk the Slayer or Vi, which I think is kind of more paranormal, but it's like a Russian old, it's like VIY. So yeah, and like I was saying, I think with this podcast I want to talk about lesser known things, and I think there's like fan bases for everything, but I think, yeah, if I could introduce one person to one cool new thing, then it's done its job. But yeah, so I think kind of that's a good introduction on me. And I've definitely got distracted and went off on a tangent about stuff, but that's kind of the point. And yeah, and it's just, I don't know if you can hear it in my voice, but yeah, I absolutely love this stuff. Like, I love fantasy to death, kind of all of it. And I think kind of with this podcast, as I was saying, I want to like show the less known stuff, but I think also for myself, I want to kind of try the stuff that I brush aside, or kind of read things or watch things or just experience different versions of fantasy which I wouldn't naturally go towards, because I think there's merit in all kind of fantasy, or to be honest, in all creativity in general, because I know you can kind of turn your nose up at like generic stuff, and there are definitely people that will do stuff just to kind of get paid, which is fair enough. But I think no matter how by the books it is, no matter how like cookie cutter it can be, I think everyone, like whether it's the words you choose or like the cadence of your voice or just minor details, I think are just fascinating. And so I think I want to kind of push myself and just explore the grand world of fantasy to like its full extent, to like steal all the ideas basically. No, just to kind of like understand this genre I love so much even better. So I think, like I said, that's a good introduction. So now I should kind of talk about, if you're still here, my kind of style of fantasy, if you will. Like, I think, so the way I like to describe it is working class fantasy. And it's an idea that I've kind of been like grappling with for a long time, where, I don't know, like, I think, I don't know, like, so I think fantasy obviously comes from like mythology and folklore. And I think a lot of that plays on kind of royalty and like knighthoods and an emphasis on the upper class. And there's even, I was reading a book called A Brief History on Fantasy, which kind of does what it says on the tin. And in it was talking about how the Arthurian legends was kind of like a modern British mythology for the upper classes, which makes sense because they're all like kings and knights and it's all like great, and I do love the Arthurian legends. And then apparently Tolkien came at it with wanting to make a mythology for the middle classes with the Tolkien, with the Hobbit and Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion and his huge world. And not to sound like so arrogant to put myself next to those two, but I think that's at least what I'm attempting to kind of create, like a mythology for the working class and the lower classes, and kind of tell these grand stories, because I think it's always touched on. You always see it for moments where, like, the two examples I always come back to is like in Spirited Away, when I can never remember her name, the main character, she's running down that staircase on the side of the building to get down to the like the coal master or whatever his name is, and she like hits the wall, and that toad guy chef, I mean, he smokes a cigarette outside the window, and yeah, it was just such a small moment where it's something where it's like clearly, and I remember because he is super small, and he's like, he goes out, has a couple of tokes, and then he gets called back in, he like flicks it away, then runs in, and it's something where I used to actually be a chef myself, and it feels very real because he's clearly something that he shouldn't be doing. He's not going on a cig break, like, or smoke break, like he's trying to get away with it, and he gets caught like almost immediately, and then he kind of just gives in. And so I think that's really cool. And there was a scene in one of the Harry Potter films where it's like in an inn or a pub or something, and this witch, like a stereotypical looking witch, knocks on the door, and she's like, room service, and then gets yelled at or roared at by some creature, and then the like tiny scene ends. And it's stuff like that. And also I think a big thing you see a lot is in films and scenes where someone's explaining like, this hidden structure was built, but like no one knew about it, and then they show like a montage, or they just show like 50 to 100 people building this hidden structure, and you're like, I'm pretty sure they know about it. So it's stuff like that where it's, I think, like, obviously everyone's kind of, well, all classes have their place in society, but I think it's quite rare that the working class kind of get mythologized, or at least kind of things of the working class get mythologized. Because an example is, say, like the sword, which is something that still to this day is a very expensive thing. Because I'll try not to go on another tangent, but like, so like with weapons, I think like a lot of weapons, a lot of like kind of medieval weapons came from farm equipment, because kingdoms would have peasant armies, and then you would have like an axe or a flail, or kind of, I don't know, like a bill hook, or like a club or something like that. Maybe not a club, but like you'd have these tools, which then, whilst are just part of your livelihood, then could essentially just become a weapon. And then obviously as time kind of progressed, they got more and more refined, but the sword was just always a weapon. So therefore it was always like a status symbol. So one of the things I've done in my stories is a thing called a witch club, which is basically a stick with like the trapped spirit of something inside, and you kind of wake it up and use that as a weapon. And it's one of those little things that I'm very kind of proud of, because it's mythologizing something which is very common. And you have it obviously with like Bata, or it's Bata, the like Irish stick fighting. And yeah, so that's the kind of thing I want to do to like the highest degree. And I think there's definitely a lot of different stories I'd like to tell. I'm currently working on a novel, which is a very small kind of insular story, and it will be a trilogy just about essentially like a man getting his life together whilst operating in the working class of like what I call the mortal and the mythical worlds of like the real world and the magic worlds. But also I have lots of ideas of like the classic ensemble adventure or great wars or whatever, and I think it's something that can be done where just kind of showing a great big expansive world, like fantastical, with all the depth of everything else, just from a different perspective. So that's kind of my grand plan. And I think part of this is kind of bringing people along for the journey, and whilst I don't necessarily think it'd be very interesting for people to like have a camera on me whilst I'm writing, like just watch you or have you watch me kind of just get writer's block. But I feel like Fantasy Talk, this podcast, and just the endless supply of like fantasy material and the plethora of media that it's kind of found itself in is something I could talk about forever. So if you've stuck it out, if you're interested, I'll be doing this as and when. It's all a work in progress, but this is Fantasy Talk, and we can talk about fantasy sometime soon. Bye bye.